Hello everybody. Have any of you ever been in a situation where you felt so anxious about the situation that you just can't control yourself? You know, your heart rate goes up, your chest feels tight, you start hyperventilating even. And you find that no matter what you do, talking to yourself, positive thinking, meditation, is not very successful at calming you down. Have you also discovered that in other situations, you're feeling equally anxious, but those techniques do in fact work? And are you ever confused as to why that might be the case? Well, in this video, I wanted to discuss the very kind of fundamentals of where anxiety comes from and make a very important point, which is that depending on where in your brain anxiety arises from, you must use very different methods to combat it. Fundamentally, anxiety is all produced in the same part of the brain. It's called the amygdala, and that's what releases the hormones that causes you to feel anxiety and stress. However, the origins of anxiety can come from a different part of the brain. There are two major centers of the brain that can generate anxiety. The first is the cortex. The cortex is basically what distinguishes human beings from most other animals. It's what allows us reasoning thought and imagination, but that can also cause us anxiety. Cortex-based anxiety is where you're constantly turning thoughts over in your mind, or you're imagining disastrous scenarios. Have you ever been in these situations? You're worrying about a job interview, you're constantly worrying about your exam performance or what kind of job you might get in future, or you're imagining disaster scenarios, or your boss has used a slightly negative tone of voice and now you're wondering whether or not he actually likes you anymore. All of these things are kinds of cortex-based anxiety, produced in the frontal lobes or the reasoning parts of our brain. For this type of anxiety, very effective techniques are things like thought substitution, switching the negative thought for something more positive, meditation, talking therapy, positive thinking, all of the many techniques that I've discussed in previous videos. But there is a different type of anxiety, an anxiety that perhaps you could say is more fundamental, that arises purely from your amygdala. That is very important because the anxiety that arises from your amygdala directly is a very primordial, primitive form of anxiety. The amygdala itself is quite a primitive part of our brain. All animals have it. It is the fight or flight response. How does the amygdala form anxiety-based responses? Well, it's based on learning. If you've ever been in a highly stressful or unpleasant situation, the amygdala forms neural pathways such that if you encounter that situation again, it will release the hormones and adrenaline that causes you to feel anxiety. In other words, if, like myself, I was on a transatlantic flight one year and the plane dropped maybe 30 seconds, straight nosedive, I have no idea what happened. People were screaming, kind of the food trolleys were overturning in the aisle. We all thought we were going to crash. Ever since then, I had a fear of flying. Before then, I loved flying. That is an amygdala-based anxiety. That forms such a strong impression on my amygdala that now when I get on a plane, I start to feel the feelings of anxiety and panic. The amygdala is a very powerful organism insofar as it will basically short-circuit your cortex. What that means is that reasoning-based and talking-based techniques do not work when you're in the grips of amygdala-based anxiety. If you've ever felt that just kind of sheer terror, or what might, when you look back on it, feel like irrational fear, that's your amygdala talking. And the reason you look back and think, why on earth was I so panicked about that? That was completely irrational, was because your rational thought processes are shutting down at the point at which your amygdala is triggered. So you know you have an amygdala-based anxiety problem when it's not arising from thoughts or logical processes that are going on in your brain. If it originates in the amygdala, it just hits you, and it's situational based. Now the amygdala works by having had neural pathways formed, and these pathways can form for all kinds of things. They can form for things that happen in your childhood, negative experiences. They can even be very illogical things. For example, there are people, bad things happen, say for example when they were wearing a particular perfume or smelled a particular smell. And from then on, if they smell that smell, the amygdala will interpret it as a dangerous situation and will trigger an anxiety response. So these absolutely do not have to be logical fears in any way at all. There's a story, in fact, of a soldier that came back from the Vietnam War. He cured his PTSD, but 20, 30 years later, he started having anxiety attacks again, and he wanted to know why. Well, it turned out that his wife had switched the soap they were using to one that smelled very similar to that which he encountered when he was in the army. And the amygdala interpreted the scent as being back in a battle zone and triggered the anxiety response. That's how powerful the amygdala is. It forms these associations. Now, how do you break amygdala-based anxiety? Well, firstly, when you are feeling anxious, the amygdala requires a physical stimulus, not a talking stimulus. Don't try and reason your way out of it. To try and calm down the amygdala-triggered anxiety, that kind of anxiety attack, is not good enough to try and cut thoughts, because thoughts aren't the origin. All you need to do is deep breaths. You need to relax your muscles, try and stretch out your muscles. Tense muscles are things that fire up your amygdala. Exercise, regular exercise, calms down your amygdala. Sufficient sleep calms down your amygdala. So these are all very physical techniques that help your amygdala calm down when you're in the moment. However, if you truly want to get over amygdala-based anxiety, what you need to do is form new neural pathways in your brain. What that actually ultimately means is you need to expose yourself to the stressor or the situation that's causing the activation and make it into a positive experience, by which I mean you manage to withstand the situation until your anxiety is materially decreased, and you keep on doing it such that in future the trigger becomes less and less strong. It may interest a lot of you to know that actually when I was a very young child I was terrified of dogs. Now of course I have two lovely dogs and I'm not terrified at all. When I was younger I saw a dog, it triggered the amygdala, the flight or fight response. How did I get over it? Well, my mum went and bought a dog one day, and so I was exposed to that dog every single day. At the beginning I was terrified, but my mum was like, you know, just sit in the room with the dog for 30-40 seconds, calm yourself down, and then gradually we got closer and closer to the dog, and before long I wasn't scared of dogs at all. And a little further time after that I actually loved dogs. That's what I mean. The amygdala offers us a lot of hope because it's not fixed. You're not fixed into experiencing anxiety and panic attacks. The brain is plastic. You can rewire those nerves, you can rewire those neural pathways and completely solve the problem. But unfortunately the way is somewhat painful because in order to rewire the circuitry you have to activate it and then reroute it. So for me, flying is still a moderately stressful experience, but with every flight I take I try and calm myself down with the breathing techniques. I listen to some music, I try and watch an enjoyable film or something. I try and make it into a positive experience, and then each flight I subsequently take, it gets a little bit better as my neural pathways are rewired. If you have a genuine anxiety problem, of course it's always best to consult a professional. But the big message from this video is you need to use the right technique to attack the right type of anxiety. If yours is a cortex-based anxiety problem, by which I mean you're turning thoughts over in your mind, or you're imagining vivid scenarios, or interpreting the world in negative ways, this can be solved by talking therapy. It can be solved by replacing your thoughts with more positive ones. It can be solved by meditating, so on and so forth. But if the trigger of your anxiety fundamentally is not from the cortex, it's from the amygdala, if it's a situational-based anxiety response, it's hardwired into you, then you need some help in rewiring your brain.